So, what's at stake here in Lake Washington? Why do we need to stay open? Jesus has plenty of franchises. What's so special about us? Why do we labor so hard? Whenever I think, this question obviously is being posed as we each do some reflection in our life, as we bring to conclusion our pledge drive this year, celebrating with a cake afterwards. So hopefully you'll all stop by and get a little slice of diabetes. But it's sanctified. Yeah, and mine too. So whenever I think about pledge drives, you obviously think about money. Whenever I think about money and connecting it with the church, I think about a man named Ray Fisher. Ray was a patents lawyer. This was back when I was the pastor in Spokane at Central. Amazing man. He was a single man. He was a quiet man. He was a very good and decent man. There was no scandals in his life, no weird behavior, no eccentric acting out. He was just salt of the earth, a good and basic and decent man. As a child, he had been raised in the church, but he had walked away, mostly from boredom. Not that he was looking for any, shaking church, no hopping and hollering and Pentecostal, charismatic, waving church. He just thought the church was irrelevant to his life. There was just nothing there for him. It wasn't about the story. He believed the story of the church. It wasn't about the people. He appreciated the people of the church. He just went into a lull of his life and simply walked away from the church because there was no, maybe to use this metaphor, it's mine, not his. He just simply wasn't being fed anything. And for years, he walked away. For decades, he walked away. And then later in life, he was in his mid-70s at the time, he had a chance encounter with another wonderfully gracious, kind, compassionate, decent man, a guy named Earl Houck, who just happened to be a pastor. And they wound up in a whole series of conversations. And in the midst of those conversations, Ray had his heart strangely warmed, as we Methodists would say. He found himself coming back to church. And he tried to summarize it, when I met him, he tried to summarize it to me by saying that it was through his conversations with Earl that he realized, he had a revelation, an epiphany of sorts. He realized that his entire life had been running on the grace, the blessing, the unconditional goodness that he had experienced in church, in the community of faith, as a young boy. Now, an older man in his 70s, he realized that he, in his words, had basically mooched off the gift that was given to him and had not returned a thing. He realized that the goodness of his own life was not his alone. Rather, he was simply living out his training, living out the normality he had been given by an old church that did simple things like praying for each other, potlucking with each other, doing good deeds and projects together, singing hymns of faith and hope together, and being there for each other, like the time Willie lost his wife and the entire congregation wrapped themselves around that family, helped watch Willie's kids while he tried to put the pieces of his life back together and continued to work. The revelation to Ray was one of profound gratitude. And so now in his 70s, he decided that his ministry, his act of service, was to give back. And he started by returning to worship. And over time, he created his own little ministry. He knew 5 pastors. I was the 5th one. and he began to invite them over to his house. Now, we knew of each other's existence, but we never, ever met together. He always had us over one at a time. And Ray would make the best microwave meals I have ever had. Something magical happened. Something weird happened in his house. Those meals were just succulent. I just loved them. And of the 5 pastors, it ran the gamut. I'm very much, and certainly even more so then, very much known as liberal, both theologically and politically. And then my opposite in this conference is a guy named Dave Parker, who's extremely conservative, and I think a little bombastic, me being perfect, of course. But Dave Parker, Rich Lang, were both guests at Ray Fisher's table. Something I pull from that, a learning that I've had from that, is to this day, to this very moment, Dave and I are very civil and cordial. We'll even go out for a cup of coffee at annual conference together. In battle, we're like, 2 buffoons smashing against each other. But there is, we have something in common, and it's Ray Fisher. And that's a lesson, too, of how, at least, to remain civil with folks you would assume would be your antagonist or your enemy. That's something we try to teach here in the church. Well, Ray was he loved history, absolutely loved history, kind of had this thing about John Wesley. And so, that would be the substance of a lot of our conversation, is the history of the church, the history of John Wesley, the implications of Methodism. But what I mostly remember when I visited Ray was time stood still. And all of the stresses of my life faded away. And for a couple hours, I could simply relax. This is kind of what I imagine it's like to be in the presence of Jesus. Just calm. No matter the storm you come out of, just calm. And although Ray was unique, I do think the church produces Ray Fishers over and over again, all the time. I've met a bunch of Rays in my life. In many ways, it is what the church is. It's a school of spiritual maturity that produces hopeful, encouraging, kind people for the world. But Ray taught me something else. As a patents lawyer, Ray had had a very good life. He wasn't rich, filthy rich, but he was very well off. And after Ray came back to the church, he began to think about all those years away. He was very organized and meticulous in his life, and so he researched all of his life's earnings over the decades and decided he would play catch-up. He decided to tithe 10% of everything he had ever made to the church. Not just to the church, to 3 churches, actually. The one who had raised him, the one that was in his neighborhood, because Ray still occasionally would go to Christmas service and Easter service for nostalgia's sake, and to the church where I happened to be the pastor because I was Earl Houck's replacement. And over the course of several years, we 3 churches absolutely became beneficiaries of Ray's generosity. He's the one that taught me simple lessons that were profound in my life. At Central, we had a shalom zone going on where we would feed 200 to 300 people at a time, and they would come. And so you can figure it out. You know how much that the car camping hits our budget. Well, this shalom zone was really draining the budget of Central. And so, the temptation is to go to someone like Ray and say, could you give to the Shalom Zone? Well, Ray, and I talked with Ray about that, Ray gave to the church. And what he taught me about that is he said, if the church is strong, the ministry will be strong. If the church is strong, the ministry would be strong. It was a profound lesson in my life because I found that to be true. Not that you can't do, as Dave was saying, philanthropy outside of the church, but he made me realize that the primary calling of the church is the church. I'll just talk about that in a few minutes. When I asked Ray how he even came to this decision to tithe, his history essentially, his one-word reply came immediately and simply: gratitude. Just gratitude. Ray was not a flashy man. He had a deep soul about him. He's the type of guy that if you painted a picture of him, you have to include light all around him. Of everyone I've ever met, I think it was Ray who taught me the most about generosity of spirit. What an incredibly hospitable man he was to be around. And he taught me also about generosity of our assets. He is the reason that I have continued to tithe. He's the one that really, really cemented that into my life. And so, in other words, it's people like Ray. I want to be more like Ray and less like myself. On the opposite end was a fellow named T. James. His first name was Thus James. So we all called him T. James. And he was a street person who lived off of a disability check, which would allow him to have enough money to pay rent. Now, this is Spokane. It's about, 15 years ago, downtown Spokane, where they still had those hovels, those kind of hotels, not hotels, those kind of apartment buildings where single people could live in. But it was the kind of apartment building that when you went visiting there, you went home and decided to take a shower because you had no idea what bug jumped on you. They were dark, and they were gloomy, and they were dirty, and they were scary, and hundreds of people lived there who, in that ministry, it was my privilege to interact with. And T. James was one of them. Would have been homeless here, was able to afford a place to at least have a roof over his head there. He had always been poor. He could barely read. Throughout his entire life, he never really held a job. He held a series of jobs, just kind of day laborer type jobs, just enough to get him through the week, to supplement his habits, to supplement just living. He ate mostly at McDonald's, and that eventually caught up with him, because I think he died at a too early age of all kinds of disease that was in him that could tie into diet. Well, I met him, Spokane, it snows a lot. I met him over a course of several weeks when I was shoveling. Don't get any ideas with this example, by the way. I was shoveling the sidewalk outside the church, and Jim, who happened to live right across the street, the apartment building there was right across the street, he was shoveling that driveway. And so we would banter back and forth for about 2 or 3 weeks when he crossed over one Sunday morning, grabbed my shovel from me, and said, "Pastor, get ready for church. I'll take care of this." From that day forward, T. James called me Tom Sawyer. And he's right. But he also became my very best friend. Jim taught me about poverty. He taught me about what it does to a person inside, as well as, obviously, the outside. But he talked about the inside. He also taught me how to navigate the streets, how to interact with the mentally ill, how to accept gifts from the poor, which is so important for a middle-class person like myself to do. He would, from time to time, come and pull me out of the church office and take me for walks around the downtown because, as he said, "Pastor, that's your mission field." He taught me about his philosophy in life. He shared with me his own biography, horrible, the many, many traumas of his childhood, the time he was in prison, the time he was in the psych ward, how he lived on the streets throughout his life. He taught me about his own moral code, but most importantly, he just taught me about simple friendship, how to cross the boundaries into each other's life. And he was also volatile. He could go off at any moment. But he also taught me how to walk with him through those emotional meltdowns, not merely forgiving, but going deeper so that I might understand and see reality through his own eyes. A story, I think, that might play this out is this. Like I said, we served meals twice a week. A couple hundred people would show up. My boys were raised in the environment of homelessness. They all have memories of what it was to be in Spokane, and so they were always with me during those meals. Andy was maybe 3 or 4 years old at the time. He was my youngest, and he got away from me. And something happened. I got absorbed in something else, and Andy got away from me. Well, what any good, normal pastor's kid's going to do is he's going to go zero in on the places in the church that he knows the best, Dad's office. So he went running upstairs to Dad's office. Well, the upstairs of that church was absolutely off limits. Everything was downstairs during the meal. So Andy was alone, and there was no lights on, and he went upstairs trying to get into the office. Well, one of T. James's jobs that he would do is he would do security during the meal. And he found Andy up there. And T. James comes running down. And all I know is the next minute I turn around and Jim is in my face. Don't you know the boogeyman is out? Don't you know the boogeyman is out? I mean, it was like that. And I was completely freaked out. And he basically marched me upstairs to grab Andy to get Andy back under my wing. The boogeyman was Jim. Jim himself, now Spokane was the dumping ground of the system for level 3 child sex offenders. Jim himself was a victim of that. And he knew that Andy being up there was a temptation. And so he came to me to protect Andy, not just from himself, but from whoever was around. Jim became very important in the life of my family. He taught my kids how to plant potatoes. He helped Andy later, a couple years later, carve his Cub Scout, what do you call that? The car, the derby car. Thank you, yeah. He would go with me to their Little League games. He'd watch over Mike, who was a little bit older, because Mike would be shooting hoop in the gym with a bunch of street drunks. And T. James would he didn't play sports, of course, but he would just kind of watch over, make sure Mike was okay. My kids grew up around homeless men, and Jim, in many respects, was the angel who kept an eye on them. There are some gifts that can never be repaid. My friendship with Jim shaped my life and can never be repaid. Now, the point of me telling you about Ray and Jim is that the church really did produce both of them. I don't know anywhere else in society that gives me consistent opportunity to meet those who are not like me. The church at its best has a little bit of everybody in it. The church at its best is always trying to stretch us beyond ourselves, always trying to expand our capacity to love even that person, and even that person, and even that person. The text in Ephesians teaches us that every congregation has been given gifted individuals like Ray and T. James who help equip us for ministry. In other words, for the doing of good deeds throughout our life. Ray's ministry was to 5 pastors. T. James's ministry was to the street, and certainly to my family. Ministry is service. It's giving of yourself. It requires sacrifice and some form of risk. Each one of us, me too, needs to have a ministry outside of ourselves, outside of our jobs, outside of our role. Who are you in ministry with? To whom are you giving your gifts and your presence? In verse 12, we're taught that the gifts that we are given are for the building up of the body of Christ. In other words, you. As we gather in this room, 80 to 100 of us, week in and week out, we gather to build each other up, to encourage one another, to care about one another, to check in with one another. The way Methodists say it is to watch over one another with love, to know each other by name, to actually like each other. You miss the point if you come to church and leave. You miss the whole point. The body of Christ is not an ideal floating around in the universe, nor is it contained only in a mystic interior experience. I'm looking at the body of Christ, which is amazing. Is it true? How do I learn to see Jesus, to receive Jesus, to be like Jesus? That's the maturity this text is talking about. How do we learn to do that so that it's second nature in our life? So to be personal for a second, or I guess I've been personal all along, our car camper ministry, for example, is absolutely foundational to the future of this church. And I want to go a step further. Any church that does not have personal relationship with the poor is simply not worth attending. It misses the point of the gospel. But it's not the most important part. The most important part is how we treat one another, how we care about one another. Again, do we know one another's stories? We are so blessed in this pledge drive to simply hear from each other for a few minutes. Testimony, a story. It's framed around why I give, but I know Dave Asher a little better now. That's the point. We don't have to be in each other's business. That's not a church. But to know each other well enough to watch over each other so no one faces their life alone. That's holiness. That's the point of the gospel, the point of coming to church. And so I want to lift that up because I think it's the most important thing. Last story about Spokane. Spokane was extremely successful when I look back at my life. That ministry won awards. I made a name for myself. We really helped people. We helped facilitate people's evolution in life. Everything about it was good. And almost every day that I was there, I was fighting the leadership of the church. And sometimes the church would fight each other. And when I left Central, the one thing I said to myself was, my next church, I don't care anymore if I'm successful. We would learn to love one another. So God, the great joker in the universe, I arrive in July. In February was that great earthquake that happened in Seattle. And I get a call from Pat Simpson. There's this organization called Tent City. They're looking for and that was back in the beginning. And so, another time, I'll tell you the whole story another time. But, as you can imagine, because you've had your own experience, what happened to you happened to us. The neighborhood blew up. It went insane. It went crazy. We got sued we were getting fined by the city. We got picketed by our neighbors, on and on and on. But I still remember when I gathered the congregation together to let them know what was about to happen. And there was only 45 of us. Only 45 were left in that big old building in Ballard. And I still remember one by one, they went around the room and they spoke their piece, and they all said, we have to open ourselves to the life of those who need us. And the one woman who disagreed, when it came time for her to talk, all she said is, I abstain because I'm part of this church. So we didn't squabble over that. As a matter of fact, that church really did love each other, and they learned to love the stranger. So our story, the story that our kids are growing up in, and we are infected by it every day, but our kids are really bearing this type of story in their life. Every day, they are being hammered with a story of despair. The cosmos is a random accident. It has no purpose or meaning. There is no one home in the universe. All you see is all there is. The goal of life is to have more toys. You can't trust leaders because they're corrupt. You can't trust the rich because they're trying to screw you. You can't trust the poor because they just want to mooch off of you. You can't trust those who don't look like you because you might get hurt. Watch what you say. Watch who you're with. And by all means, remember that you only exist when you're on social media. And we wonder why teenage suicide rates are so high. It's a story of despair, nihilism. Our story is different. The story we tell, the story we learn is different. Jesus said it in a profoundly simple way. Love one another. And another product of the church, a guy named Dostoevsky, said it like this. Love a man even in his sin. He was writing in early 1900s. Love a man even in his sin, for that is the semblance of divine love and is the highest love on earth. Love all God's creation, the whole of it, and every grain of sand in it. Love every leaf, every ray of God's life. Love the animals, love the plants, love everything. If you love everything, you will perceive the divine mystery in things. And once you have perceived that, you will begin to comprehend it better each day. And you will come at last to love the world with an all-embracing love. Or as Paul said, God as all in all. When we do these things, we live and we give life. That is what I think is at stake in our thriving. Amen.